question. What are your thoughts about dating people with no close friends or no friends at all because they cut them off?
I'd have to know more about the person. I mean, because there's two black and white ways to look at this, but obviously the answer is a gray area. We're potentially looking at a person who has very good boundaries and has been surrounded by a lot of toxic people and has decided that they don't want to be surrounded by them. That is a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe we're looking at a person with such low distress tolerance for conflict that they cut people off way too soon, in which case that's maybe not great conflict management. I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, there's so much context that goes into a question like this that it's basically impossible for me to answer it. Now, I will say that it's generally, and I have to say generally because there are always exceptions, but I am generally not a huge proponent of your significant other being your only social engagement. I am a believer that humans should have you don't have to have a massively wide net, but you should have some social net around you, because if you put all your eggs in the intimate relationship basket, you are playing with fire. So humans are relational animals. We exist in communities. We exist in wider systems. Having friends or a support system and family or whoever around the relationship, one, helps a person maintain their sense of autonomy within the relationship and outside of it, and also makes it so that the relationship itself is not the only thing that's relied upon in a given moment. So I'm not going to generally advocate for a person to only invest in their significant relationship, but there are certainly exceptions to that. I'm sure there's probably going to be somebody who watches this video who says, I've been together with my partner for 30 years, we do everything together, and we don't have anybody else in our life that matters to us, in which case, awesome. I'm glad you figured out a way to make it work. But in general, that's not something that as a relationship therapist I'm going to advocate for.
I would also say, because this is something that I feel like it's talked about a lot, specifically on Twitter, which I know you hate.
Yep.
But I think it's important to distinguish between your significant other being like your only other person that you communicate with versus your significant other being your primary person that you communicate. Those are two very, very different things. And I feel like people who fall in the latter often get upset because they feel like they're being lumped into the former. And you need to do a little bit of self-reflection before you react, I think, to those conversations. Because if it's your primary and you do typically tend to do everything with them, but you also, do interact with other people here and there, even if it's one or two other people, I think that's more in line with kind of what you're saying, versus only significant other all day, all night, that's it, and all week. That's when you tend to see a few more problems.
It's
arise.
dicey. Yep.
It gets kind of dicey, yeah. Also, I was gonna say, I wanted to ask you this question because when I read this question, I saw it as one of those questions that's just gonna piss off a client, where I'm literally just gonna throw that question back at you because I don't have enough data. Like, I'm gonna say, what are your thoughts about dating somebody who's really cut off?
It's
seems like
such a hard question to
let's
answer.
talk about that.
Yeah.
I don't have any hard and fast ones on it because we are also proponents of cutoff here if they are necessary and healthy. Like, if you need to cut somebody off and it's better for you, cut them the fuck off.
Do it.
Oh wait, I forgot. This is the VOD. Damn it.
Speaking of cutoff, well, I dropped an F-bomb too, so we're even.
Oh shit, baby, we're good then. But yeah, no, like, I just like kind of this black and white catch-all language. That's a little harder to
we're gonna both be very anti-catch-all language all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just not a way that therapists approach things. That's one of the things that drives me crazy about how mental health and relationships are talked about on social media, because it is very cut, dry, black, white. People trying to engage in nuance when other people aren't. Like, it's a mess, because there is never going to be 280 characters that encapsulates all of everything. It's impossible.
Yeah, agreed. And nuance is terrible for Twitter.
Nuance equals gray areas equals dissonance equals aversive arousal equals anxiety equals people generally being avoidant of it. So when people talk about wanting nuance, but a lot of times run away from it because it forces them to be uncomfortable and tough. If you want to have a more fulfilling representation of the world, and I think a more fulfilling existence, you have to be open to nuance. Trying to box stuff in is because there's always an exception, so then there's always an argument, and it's just never going to work out for you to have black and white thinking is a cognitive distortion from a cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint. So take that for what you will.
This one kind of relates. And we kind of touched on it last time, but I do think it's an interesting question that you kind of can always find a different answer to. But if there was a conversation you wish people would have early on in a relationship that people might be hesitant to have, what do you see most often? How do you suggest approaching that combo?
I mean, the sex one definitely comes to mind. As soon as you have decided mutually that this is going to be a relationship that involves sex, you should start talking about it.
You don't know mine?
Yeah, go ahead, because I need to think a little bit about mine.
I think that if it is a long-term relationship that you are engaging in, and it doesn't even need to be one that involves marriage, because I know that marriage is not something that everybody believes in or is a configuration that works for them. But if it's a long-term relationship, I think the family planning conversation is something you need to have extremely early on. And I also think it's a conversation that we don't talk about enough as a check-in, because as life goes on and as circumstances change, your thoughts on that can also change. And it should not just always be assumed that having that conversation once means that you are going to know the answer to that conversation forever. So family planning is kind of my big one.
I would agree with that.
It literally could be as simple as like, do you want kids? No. Oh, sweet. Me neither. All right, cool. We'll check in about this in a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean,
that's all you have to do.
Absolutely. And I do think that like there's a part B to that, which is if you know in your gut that your answer to that question is true, whether it's yes or no, at that specific point in time. Yes, it could change. I acknowledge that. But at that specific point in time, if you know it in your gut to be true, and that person tells you the thing that goes against that, you should head it off at the pass and probably end it. Because you are inviting a world of hurt if you are firmly in a position that the other person isn't. Now, if the other person says, I'm not sure, and you're firmly in that position, cool, right? But if one person says, I know I don't want kids, and the other person says, I do know I want kids, you could be super compatible in just about any way, but if that's generally a hard line that blows up relationships. Like, there is no real gray area with kids. You either have them or you don't. You can't have half a kid, and you can't have temporary kids. So I do agree that like you do need to have that conversation up front if you know that you're seeking a long-term relationship. If it's just a fling, whatever. But if you know it's long, but if you hit a point where a fling starts to turn into a long-term relationship, you should have that conversation. Yeah.
Which, funny enough, is another one you should have early on. Is after a short bit, you should be thinking about, is this something that we're going to take more serious, or is this something that we're going to keep a little bit more casual? Because that's also really important to know.
And as we're saying this, I do want to add, it's not a counterpoint, but it's an alternative thing to consider. I'm generally not fond of people thinking they have their entire relationship future ironed out at the outset. I think if a person is like ridiculously rigid about it, all the things they very specifically want in a relationship, that's not great. Because relationships do flow. There are things that are going to change by virtue of the dynamics you create within the relationship you're in. And I do think you box yourself in by overly defining every aspect of your relationship at the outset. So that's not great either. These are big, important things, which is why Jared and I are talking about these things. But some of the small stuff, like, well, I know that I'm probably going to want a house with a 2-car garage. Like, okay, like, we don't need to be doing that right away.
However, location is something that you should talk
important.
about.
So that's where I'm at, is because, and I think this partly comes from personal experience, but also in working with folks that have been in this position, is what are your career and life plans that are deeply important to you? Like do you have a place that you're hoping to move to someday? Do you have a certain type of career that you're trying to achieve? Because if you do have that defined and there's a pathway to it, you ought to be open about that. One of the hardest conversations I had with my own wife, because we met after I graduated from my master's program, after I already knew that I was going to go to my PhD program. We started dating that summer. And one of the hardest things that I had to say to her is, I'm moving in 3 months. Like, I'm going to Virginia. So if we're going to do this, that's got to be part of it. And I'm not going to change that. And she was cool with it. So, like, knowing that you have, like, grad school or something on the horizon, you should be upfront about that. I think anytime you're withholding something because you're worried if you disclose it, it's going to ruin the relationship, you ought to disclose that thing. It's a good rule of thumb.
You don't have to do it, like, immediately. There does need to be some urgency. But it's not like this thing's popping in my head 3 times. I better call this person up and just get it out. But if it pops up enough, it's like, okay, how do I talk about this?
Yep.
Also, if there's anybody who's like, I feel like this is really important for like younger folks to hear, because I don't think you hear it that often. It's okay to have these conversations and then things change. Because there's a very good chance that they are going to change.
Yep.
Because that's how life works. But you don't necessarily need to have all this stuff ironed out. It might be helpful, but I mean, I'm sure for you, I know this is true for me if we're going to go personal. I am not where I thought I would be at this place at all. Like if I were, say, 21, like fresh graduating college.
No, this isn't what you planned?
No, not at all. So what I wanted when I was 21 is very, very different. And it's okay for those things to change because they have to.
Yeah.
So it's good to have an idea. It's good to have these conversations. But if you get down the road and those things change, it shouldn't be you told me to have these conversations, now they're different. Screw you guys. It's like, no, it's something you check in with constantly, depending on how life has interacted with you, for lack of a better term.
In a different way, I agree with you. I'm not at all at 32 where I thought I was going to be at 32. If you told me when I was 21, I would have never believed it. Also, fun fact, a personal story. When my wife and I were dating and decided we were going to be a thing, we were on her... My wife lived with her parents during grad school. We were sitting on her parents' back deck, and it was like very obvious we were having the conversation of like, are we exclusive? Like, are we doing this? And she said, I want to get married and I want to have kids. So if you can agree to those 2 things, then we can do this. And at the time, as a 24-year-old person who hadn't really given much thought to those things, I said, yep, me too. And over the span of our relationship, Allie and I both realized that it took me longer to get on board with marriage, as Jared knows, but I got on board with marriage, but we both realized we don't want kids. And that happened through the check-in conversations that Jared's referring to. So these are real things that affect therapists. They affect lay folks. Like these are real conversations that you have to have. Things do change. The important point about all of this from a relationship standpoint is that you talk about it. There's so many of these things that people will sit on and they will not talk about, and that's why I make this very oversimplified statement of, if there is something you need to say that you're worried could impact the relationship significantly, you should say it. Because maybe it will, maybe it won't, but it gives your relationship an opportunity to handle it. And you don't get to decide another person's response or answer to what you have to say. You let them respond to it how they will.
I'm actually going to bring this up just because I think it's a really good tangent, and also because you and I both have both therapy and personal experience with it. Any tips in making long distance relationships more bearable?
I just saw it pop up on the screen. I was like, oh, geez. Okay, so Jared and I have both been in long distance relationships, much to our chagrin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Long distance relationships are hard.
Yeah.
They are. They're hard. Okay. But they don't have to be awful. It says something about your relationship if you're willing to try it with somebody. Like, there's already an inherent something there that you've identified if you're willing to try long distance, because really it goes against everything we humans are wired for evolutionarily. Like, goes against all of it. So honestly, the biggest tip that I can give is that, and this is also, by the way, a benefit to long distance relationships, is you have to say what you mean, and you have to communicate very clearly. Because when you're in a long distance relationship, you don't have always the benefit of nonverbal cues to be able to know where a person's coming from or how a person is doing. So you have to make the implicit explicit in long distance relationships. And that can be really hard to do because sometimes it feels like forced communication, but you've got to do it. I also think it's important to establish certain boundaries and expectations in the long distance relationship. You know, when will we call? What kind of flexibility do we have around canceling calls? That type of thing, because we don't have the benefit of just being in proximity to each other all the time, to where, like, if you're not available to me for 20 minutes, it's not a big deal, or a day, it's not a big deal because I know I'm going to see you. I think that's important. I think I'm speaking a little bit from personal experience, but also I've seen this enough in long distance relationships that I've worked with that I do think it's kind of not a universal principle, but I'd be curious about your thoughts on this. So long distance relationships usually have periods where you are proximal. Sometimes it's for like a short window of time. Sometimes it's few and far between. Sometimes it's relatively often. It varies. It is way easier to leave and go back to long distance angry than it is to go back sad. And sometimes people will sabotage the relationship in small ways before they go their separate ways, because it's easier to be mad when you leave than to be vulnerable and express how hard it hurts to be in a long distance relationship. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to folks that have experienced this phenomenon. I myself have experienced this phenomenon. Allie and I used to almost always get in a fight before we went back to our separate ways. And it was because it was hard for us to acknowledge that we really hated separating. And so I think this all comes into this clear and honest communication. And I do think it's okay to define some rules for the long distance relationship, but I also think that, like, you are going to have to build some of that tolerance for not knowing what that other person is doing, and it really does require some degree of trust that goes into a long distance relationship, because if you over hover to compensate for that distance, that's usually going to lead to problems. So those are kind of the things that come to mind in terms of making long distance relationships more bearable. Also, just finding ways to connect. And when Allie and I started playing Destiny together, it was the greatest decision we ever made, because it felt like we were in the same space together, even though we were not.
I don't think I ever self-sabotaged. I feel like every time I would have to leave, I was like Michael in The Office, where I would just like be like, "This is the worst," and like be on the verge of like tears.
Yeah.
I do think one mistake that a mistake that I made a few times was I had something that I wanted to bring up, but I also wanted to enjoy the
Yep.
weekend.
Yep.
So I waited to bring it up until we were like getting into our cars or I was taking her to the airport. That, from personal experience, I would not recommend.
Oh, been there, buddy.
Yeah, I've done that. I wouldn't consider that self-sabotage, more so it was just a bad decision. My number one thing is don't argue over text. It's never gonna go well.
Literally I agree with that. I agree with that completely.
I think if you are going to have an argument or you have something that you need to discuss, it should be ideally in person. But because you're a long distance, I think secondary would be some sort of video call so that you can have all of those different types of feedback that you would if you were in person. And then third, a phone call so that you can at least get tone, because the impact that the lack of tone can have on an argument is so much greater than you ever want it to be. Is the way I'd put that. So that would be like kind of one of my hard and fast rules is do not argue over text. I understand that there are going to be some configurations in which in-person, video, phone are just simply not possible, and you are going to have conversations over text, in which I would say, unless you two have iPhones, get a third-party app that does not have a text limit on it, so that you can make sure that you are getting out everything that you need to get out very clearly, and it's not coming in chunks. Because if you got to sit there and look at that bubble, that is going to also increase anxiety and frustration and potentially lead to more disastrous results.
And I'm going to explain why. Because
yes, please do.
People may be wondering, why is that, Jared and Ryan? Well, it's because in text, when you don't have tone and you don't have intensity and you don't have nonverbal context, we fill those gaps because our brains are not evolved to a point to perceive text messages as sophisticated as we do in person. We fill those gaps with projection, which means that we make assumptions about what that other person is thinking behind all of that based on our own inductive experience, which is entirely unfair to that person. So you put them in a position where, like, you think they're commenting on something that you are attending to internally, and they may not be doing that. And so now you're completely missing each other when you have the conversation because you're arguing through projection rather than through actual data. So your significant other might send you a text and it's coming from a place of sadness. And if you assume that they're mad at you because you're mad at yourself, you're going to read that text as if they're angry, and you're going to respond to anger instead of to sadness. So you need to be very careful with how you're reading that stuff. And I really do believe that what Jared's saying here is deeply important from a theoretical perspective in addition to an operational perspective, because the human brain is not evolved to a point to have sophisticated conversations through text in a way that we think we can. It's why I'm sure most people watching this can think of a disastrous conversation you've had through text, or where somebody sent you a DM and you sat on it for a while and were like, holy crap, is this person mad at me? And they're totally fine. And it's because we're just not equipped to understand how to read that. Emojis are not enough.
A conversation that I had way too late in one of my long distance relationships was I used to text the way I write papers, which is capitalization everywhere, punctuation everywhere, like all the punctuation you can I imagine just sitting there with like an APA MLA handbook in my hand while I text.
Cites himself at the end of every paragraph.
Yeah. And a conversation that I had way too late with one of my partners was she interpreted my text specifically the way that I used periods as a way of me displaying anger or frustration. And I didn't know that. And I've actually gotten that feedback from lots of other people, because I think that's just kind of how our generation works, honestly. Now I don't give a shit. I text like a person who's never taken an English class. I'm sorry, my mom was an English teacher, so that's one of the reasons where this is coming from.
You still capitalize the first word more often than not in the sentences you send.
You know what's wild is that even to this day, I still consciously will uncapitalize certain words depending on who I am talking to and the tone of the conversation in order to make sure that it matches. I do it consciously.
I believe it.
Blows, I like can't get out of it. I come from an English like household, so it's really, really hard for me. But like I had no idea that was happening. And so I would say something that I thought was just very simple, very concise, just like trying to get the point across. And she would read it as, this is sometimes an attack, or this is you being mad at me. And it would make things so much worse. And then when we finally had that conversation, it was very much just like, I'm literally just texting you. I'll say I am angry if I am angry. But me putting a period after this full sentence is not me being upset. So that's another maybe anecdotal thing for you why arguing through text is not a great idea. But that's my like big one. I mean, the thing that I think a lot of people don't know, and I learned this in grad school, I think, is that the time you do actually spend physically with one another can often feel like a mini honeymoon, and in turn like enrich the experience even more.
So it can be a lot of pressure though on the proximal time. I will say too, as a final tip for making long distance relationships more bearable, this is more aftercare for the long distance relationship. Is usually when people say long distance relationship, there's a implicit, we hope to end it eventually. Like we'd like to be proximal. Not always. There are people who have very fulfilling relationships that are long distance for huge chunks or perpetually, and that's totally cool. But the majority of people I think that are in long distance relationships would tell you that they're eventually hoping to be proximal, and that is a massive adjustment. And people often think that because that's the idealized end, that they are going to like be super happy and excited when they're proximal because that's what they've been waiting for, and that is almost more difficult of an adjustment for folks than going from proximal to long distances. So that's something that needs to be prepared for and discussed and kind of jointly ventured into, because when people put pressure on that to be awesome, it can be really troubling.
Yeah, that's another really good conversation to have, is what is it going to look like when we are no longer distanced. And I think one thing with long distance relationships that you can feel pressured into, if it's a long-term one, you do not have to immediately move in with that person once the distance is closed. It is not weird for you to move into the same place and like be in separate households, because you are going into a different configuration of the relationship that you have already had. I feel like that's like a societal pressure that I see a lot, where it's like, oh, you guys have been doing long distance for 3 years, so you guys gonna get an apartment together? You don't have to, because that's a whole different can of worms.
Yep.
So don't feel pressured into that.
Yep. Agreed.
Did I do this? No, I didn't do this one already. Do you have recommendations for how to work on the distress tolerance it takes to push through having new relationship experiences, particularly for folks who have had particularly rough experiences in relationships such as abuse, gaslighting, etc.?
Okay. Yes. I will first say, as I've said a few times, I have a video about distress tolerance. So if you want to learn more about distress tolerance, how to build it, it's a bit of an old video at this point, but the information's still good. I encourage you to watch that. Okay. I got to work backwards on this one and talk a little bit about how the human brain is wired from an evolutionary standpoint. By now, I think everybody understands that I'm almost always taking development and the brain into account when we're thinking about these things, because we have to. So when something adverse or problematic happens to a human, So if we're talking about abuse, gaslighting, etc., in a relationship, the brain files that away as something that is risky and potentially is against your survivability. And what it will do then is say, okay, so I'm going to gather all the circumstantial evidence that I can so that if I am ever in a similar position in the future, I can protect myself from it faster. Because then that way I'm not in as much risk as I was before. Think of it as, to use the burning building metaphor again, think of it as you smell smoke and you see certain lights and fire, and that indicates to you that your house is on fire. Well, maybe the next time you smell that smoke, only it's a little bit, it immediately sends your brain into, holy shit, is my house on fire, when maybe it's not. Maybe somebody blew off a firework in your backyard, okay? So the reason that I say this is because our brain's super useful evolutionary protocol can cause us significant harm now. Because what we will do at times is assume that future instances that we perceive to be similar are going to have the same dynamics that were there in the past. And something that I say often on my stream is past relationship experiences do not predict future unrelated relationship experiences. So if you come hot out of a relationship where you were cheated on, and that person would say really nasty things to you verbally, well, engaging in another relationship will probably have enough circumstantial evidence in it that your brain then fills in a certain protective gap by saying, oh shit, this is probably going to have that too, so maybe I shouldn't engage. Maybe I shouldn't give this relationship a shot because there's a chance that I'm going to be abused or gaslit again. Maybe that's true, but maybe it's not. And where this runs into problems with folks, and what I think this question is really trying to get at, is how do I override that? How do I get into a position where I can see relationships for what they are as opposed to what I'm worried they will be? And the answer to that is to carry some of the insight that I just offered in that answer, but to realize that, like, if you've been in an abusive relationship and you got out, you are more equipped to identify dynamics of abuse going forward, and you can use that as an experience to learn when to bail out of a relationship. But it doesn't mean that you have to go looking for it in a relationship and assuming that it's present, and that if it does show up, you will know how to respond. So it sounds cliche when I say this, and sometimes I get pushback from people when I say this, but like, you just have to give it a shot. And you have to realize that it is going to make you uncomfortable. That's not a bad thing. The discomfort doesn't mean that you need to bail immediately, and it doesn't mean that's what's happened before is going to happen again. What it means is that you're engaging in something that your brain is pre-wired to try to protect you from, but this is where humans have the ability to kind of use their prefrontal cortex to override that a little bit and hang in there and take the lay of the land and see what it is that you've got. And I would recommend, if you have like trauma or abuse or gaslighting in your history of relationships, you ought to probably talk to a therapist when you're trying to engage in a new relationship, because the therapist can also help be like a stable force to help you identify certain things, where as you discuss them, the therapist might say, yeah, that doesn't sound good. Or the therapist might say, you know what, I think maybe this is the trauma talking, and it seems like maybe this is something worth hanging in there with, but keep me posted. So a relationship that's really strong with the therapist can help you through that in a pretty profound way as it relates to these things. So there's always a chance that your future relationships can be as problematic as the ones in the past, but there's also a chance that they will not be. And if you close yourself off to the potential of a healthy relationship, you are going to have a hard time finding one. And it's, I think, really important to create a set of standards, boundaries, etc. Those are important, but letting some of those past experiences overly influence your perception of what the new relationship could be rather than what it is going to cause problems. You're probably going to bail sooner than you want to.
Yeah, very thorough answer.
It's something, I mean, I love this question because this is something that I see a lot with individuals who are trying to date and maybe had problematic experiences. It's an easier thing to talk about than it is to work through, and it does take time. But building distress tolerance is like exercising a muscle. It takes time to get stronger. It's not something that immediately gets stronger just because you want it to.
I got nothing else for that one. I think you answered it fully. I can go to the next one if you want to.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, I'm gonna do this one because I feel like it's gonna result in a Ryan rant. Children are often taught the saying, "If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all." Is this phrase of any use as we navigate relationships as we grow older, or could it cause more harm than good?
I was wondering if you were going to put this one up when I saw
Brother, you knew I was gonna put this one up. It's just a matter of when.
Okay. I hate that saying. I despise that saying with every fiber of my being. Because when I hear that sentence, I hear "don't hold me accountable." That's immediately what I hear. People are more resilient and hardy than we often like to think that they are.
I'd agree.
And we are, at various times in our life, there are going to be things that a person does to others that maybe isn't so great. Or there might be something that a person does that is harmful to another person. And or a person is intentionally antagonistic. And I think if a person says, "Hey dude, you're being a dick," at times that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. Is it a nice thing to say? No. But it's also true. Right? It's true to a person's experience. So, do I believe in being antagonistic and mean out of nowhere? No. I think if you are casting judgment on a person for something that's beyond their control, that is inconsequential to your existence relative to them, yeah, maybe you shouldn't say it. Like, I do believe in that. And there is an old adage of like, right, if something doesn't take less than 5 minutes to change, you probably shouldn't bring it to somebody's attention, like as it relates to appearance. Yeah, sure. But at the same time, we have to say not so nice things in order to get people to understand some of the impact that they have. And that's, I mean, an example that flashes in my head immediately is like telling somebody that they're saying stuff that's homophobic, that they're closed-minded, that they are not giving the benefit of the doubt, that what some of these actions that you're doing are pissing me off and you're being pretty mean to me. These are legitimate. That's not being mean. Saying that, setting a boundary is not being mean. Speaking to your experience is not being mean. Holding people accountable for causing harm to others is not being mean. It's not like sometimes humans have to hear not nice things because it helps you understand how you are relative to the people that are saying that. So I believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt. I believe in trying to engage through warmth. I also realize that comes from my own context where I have an immense amount of privilege to be able to give people the benefit of the doubt because I'm generally not under attack. So this is also a very like cultural and contextual saying, because there are some folks where, yeah, you ought to be nice or else you could be in danger. I have the ability as a white dude to basically say whatever I want and be critical of whatever I want to be, and there's really no ramifications for that. So I do have to acknowledge that in my answer here. But I think it depends on how that saying is being used. If you're using it as a way to teach a child to generally try to see the good in somebody and give them the benefit of the doubt and, not place judgment on things that are beyond that person's control, then I think that's an okay use of it. If it's a way of trying to get kids not to hold people accountable that harm them, that's a problem. And so we do also have to look at the way that that's being used.
I'm actually glad you clarified there, because for me, I too think it is not the greatest statement or like phrase, but as you were talking, the thing that for me always comes up with this is, especially if we're looking at the could it cause more harm than good, is in my life, you have to pick your battles. And so there are instances in which you could be fully in the right in saying something that may need to be said in a curt manner, but saying it is not going to get you any of the things that you want, and it is actually potentially going to get you a bunch of stuff that you don't want. So I do actually think there are situations in which it could cause you more harm than good, and I use the phrase "pick your battles" a lot in a lot of different aspects of life, because I mean, for me personally, and just because I think this also is also really useful for humans, is that sometimes it's just not worth it.
Right.
And so that's the first thing that came to me, and I'm kind of glad that you acknowledge that there's a bit of leeway for someone like you, where there are a lot more battles you can fight.
I can fight lots of battles, and there's very little ramification for that. And so, I think one of the things that, like, it from a developmental standpoint, when we make statements like this over and over and over again, children internalize those messages. And one of the things that I see a lot of times in my clinical work, if we zoom this out beyond just this particular saying, and we think about some of the mantras that parents will have, it can have some real damage when adults get into, like, when kids become adults. Things like one thing that I have heard countless times in my life as a therapist, and it kills me every time I hear it, is when kids are told that being emotional is embarrassing. Like those types of things, or that, like, you're letting your emotions control you, and that's going to ruin your life. Like things like that. These types of messages get internalized as absolutes by children, because they don't have an ability to have a nuanced conversation about it like Jared and I are. And so you'll see sometimes that kids will carry this message into adulthood, and then you'll find that people suppress their emotions because they have learned that it's embarrassing to the people that matter to them to express them. And that can be a problem. So in this message, it essentially says either be nice or be quiet. And a kid is going to hear that in absolute terms. They're not going to think, what's the context in which I need to be quiet? Now, again, this highlights a difference between my lived experience and yours, because you have to learn that nuance way sooner than I ever did. And that's just inherent to who you are. And that is, I think, again, that's taking nuance into account that, like, some folks don't have to pay attention to and other folks do. And that's why this is, it's easy for me and Jared to say we don't like this statement, but there is also utility to this statement in certain circumstances.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a lot more difficult of a question than I think you would originally anticipate it to be.
Yep.
But that's how most questions are, honestly.
Yep.
Before
you pull the next one up, I just want to say really quickly to everybody who is watching this VOD, or those of you that are here live, I really appreciate all of you being here. I appreciate all of the kindness and curiosity that's been in chat. I am grateful that you all support what we do. I love doing these. Time flies when Jared and I do these, and I really do want to express my appreciation for all the support. Those of you on YouTube that leave comments, thank you for doing that. Those of you that are over here on Twitch for the live stream, thanks for showing up and hanging out. We've had some new folks that have jumped in, maybe because they saw me on the browse page and they thought this would be a cool conversation to jump in on. So just thank you as always for the support. I know that I have not been attentive to chat. Normally I am. If you have questions that we don't get to, you can always ask them in questions for Dr. Mick. And again, all of the links are down in the description and in the info page on my Twitch channel and on my YouTube. So thank you all for hanging out with us and for giving us an opportunity to answer these questions. And I do hope that what Jared and I have had to say has been helpful up until this point.
Is there any weight to the 36 questions that apparently make people fall in love? You couldn't even let me get the question out.
I would be curious. Yes. But you have to know what you're doing when you ask them. Also, it's not just 36 questions. Okay. For people who are not familiar with the 36 questions, you can Google it. But essentially what it is it is a list of questions that forces pretty difficult conversation. Like, it progressively gets people into talking about things that facilitates intimacy. A little word about intimacy. The pathway to intimacy is self-disclosure. And so, like, almost completely, that's how people become more intimate, is through disclosing. Also through, like, sex and touch and stuff like that, but self-disclosure is a big one. And vulnerability is expressed via self-disclosure. So these questions only work for facilitating it. I am not going to say falling in love. That part's bullshit. It facilitates intimacy. These questions only facilitate intimacy if both people fully commit to answering them truthfully. Like, literally, that's the only way it works. And I think one of the pieces of utility to these questions is that it shows you where your blockers are to self-disclosure and intimacy. Because when you are presented with the opportunity to answer it in the midst of the person who's asking it, if you don't want to answer that question, it says more about you probably than it does the person you're sitting across from. Not always, but it can. So if you don't have a commitment from both people who are taking those questions to answer it truthfully and honestly, no matter how hurtful it may be to answer it in a truthful way, you're missing the mark on it. So does it facilitate intimacy? Yes, because it's cracking open difficult conversations. Is it something that I've ever advocated for clients to ever do? No. I think it's a tool if you want to use it, but I also don't think it's the end all be all. And the fact that it would make you fall in love, that's not how love works. Doesn't happen by answering 36 questions.
I like your frame of it helps facilitate intimacy.
Yep.
Because I don't think I've ever used this specifically. I have used like questionnaires like this before, but when I did use them, it was in what we would call like maintenance therapy, where it was a couple who came in and they're like, we're just kind of here to check in. We don't really think anything is wrong, but we just kind of want to see how we're doing or if there's anything that we want to work on. And so I would use that as kind of just like a fun thing for the couple to do, or another way in which I could learn more about them in what is a relatively short period of time. But like, I would probably never turn to the 36 questions if somebody came in and they're like, we're thinking about getting a divorce and we need your help navigating our way through it. I'm not gonna sit there and be like, interesting, okay. What does friendship mean to you?
I actually,
not the time to do it.
Along those lines, I don't think those questions are an intervention. I think those questions are an assessment tool. Like,
yeah, okay, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, but here's the thing.
Assessment is an intervention if you want to be that guy.
Oh God, no! Don't take me back. Don't take me back to that right now.
I'm just saying.
I get it. I know what you're saying, but okay. So shut up. So okay. So, but I'm gonna make the distinction for chat because instead of us having this stupid thing where we know what each other's talking about, but like, yeah. Okay. So the way this is pitched to the general public is as intervention. That this is a thing that when you do it, you will fall in love. That is a process that facilitates from point A to point B, hence intervention. I would never use this as if somebody came to my therapy room, if a couple came to my therapy room and said, we want to figure out how to be more vulnerable and intimate with each other. We want to feel closer to each other. I'm not using these questions to do that. I'm not giving them this list and saying answer it. However, this list of questions is great from an assessment tool, which is a gathering information so that I can make more informed decisions about intervention. Because again, if I see where people get tripped up, where they find themselves hesitant to answer questions that they may even have a hard time asking the other person because they're afraid of what the other person's answer is going to be, that is super good information from a therapy standpoint. So I'm more likely to use these types of things as that than I am to use it as a method to get from point A to point B.
I also think the thing that's interesting about stuff like this is they're very big catch-alls.
Yeah.
And so just because I would ask a question that is on one of these things does not mean that I think the whole thing is a valid form of assessment.
Right.
Because they're made in order to be all-encompassing and therefore more attractive to the general populace and more marketable.
Yep.
So
which gets
even
us
if there's
into
like
our
a
conversation about pop psychology, which neither one of us likes.
Yeah. Which is funny because somebody asked about that specifically, and I put it on there because I think it would be funny to ask you that, which is coming up. But
Right.
that's just that's like part of the game, if you will, with these things, is they try to make it as generalizable as possible because the more people that it can impact, the more money they're going to make.
Like the Zodiac. Stuff like
Mhm.
that. It's all written in a way to be just specific enough that you can attach to it, but just general enough that everybody can get in on it.
I am not as vigilant in my crusade of the Zodiac as you are, for I'm sure different reasons, but that is something that you like to
I know.
state.
I do.
That's not for some people. The Zodiac is useful and it serves
My wife is one of them.
purposes. Yep. And I respect that if that's what it works for you. Sure. But I also understand where someone like you is coming from. Which, while we're in this, I mean, we talked about it a little bit. I'm just gonna put it up there. What are some of the pop psychology self relationships that an average person might not think about as such? Which I think is a really interesting way.
It is a good way to put it.
That question.
It's a very sophisticated question.
I think it's gonna be hard for me to answer because I see it so quick.
Yeah.
And I'm also very jaded towards those things. I hate them.
Well, you know what? No, I'm not gonna give a as I don't need to qualify my answer for this. I will say one example right now is enneagrams. And the reason I'm going to say that is because there are corporations that legitimately use enneagrams to try to assess employee fit and mindset. And when you start institutionalizing pop psychology, it starts becoming harder for people to see it as pop psychology. People start to think it's legitimate. So when I would run for the damn hills if I was ever asked to take an enneagram or MBTI inventory for employment. You can kiss my ass if you're going to ask me to do that, because there's no legitimacy to it in any way, shape, or form. Also, that's just not the kind of thing an employer needs to be asking. So that, though, for people who don't know, legitimizes it, because you would assume if you worked for some, I don't know, Fortune 500 company that gives you an enneagram, you're going to assume that they've done their research and that that's a legitimate psychological measure, and it is not. So that, I think, from if I try to get into my layperson shoes with that would be an example of something that a person might not think is pop psychology because it's been used, because it has utility. I know you're going to probably scoff when I say this because we just got done talking about this, but I would argue that to some extent the Zodiac is pop psychology. And I do think there are people that take it so seriously that they don't see it as pop psychology. And that kind of thing, I think, can be really problematic, because if we're taking your personality and chalking it up to a star sign that was there when you were born, we're missing the mark. The reason these things are problematic is because people box themselves into expectations based on very arbitrarily defined concepts and constructs that have absolutely no backing. Enneagrams aren't real. The MBTI is not real. Introversion and extroversion isn't real. These are constructs that have been created to try to help us understand certain dynamics, but they're not law. And they don't have empirical support. So those are some examples. I'm trying to think of like anything where I've like heard people like kind of offhandedly say it, and I'm taking a little bit of a shot at boomers here, and I try not to make too much of an overgeneralization on them, but like the whole like men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing, like that's one of the most common examples of something that leaked its way in to the general vernacular, and really almost an entire generation ran with that. This idea that there are just deep psychological differences in men and women that are innate to men and women, as opposed to being totally contextual and the result of societal dynamics. And that really, I think, perpetuated this idea that like you're inherently supposed to be different, and that you should accept those differences by virtue of your gender identity as opposed to anything else. I also, in line with that, God, why do I keep losing my train of thought here? Talking about the men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing. There's another one that went into my mind, and then I finished my thought and I forgot it. Maybe it'll come back to me. But there are just opposites attract.
Damn,
and
that's actually
there it is. Say. Yeah, opposites attract, and birds of a feather flock together. It's not that simple. In fact, research usually shows that you should have more in alignment than you should have different. Differences are good because they promote autonomy, but if you are like different in almost every way, it's generally not going to work. That people really do couple better with people that they are in alignment with in terms of values and stuff like that. Difference in hobby is different than difference in value. People like similar values are very important. Different interests is a different thing, right? Like my wife likes hiking. I can't stand hiking. I like playing golf. My wife doesn't really like golf. Like we have different interests, but our values are almost completely in alignment. And so when we hear these things, we often think like, oh, well, that must have come from somewhere. Enough people say it that it's legitimate. Not necessarily. So those are the ones that come to mind for me. You what?
I actually didn't know she liked hiking because I'd never seen you hike. So
yeah, she loves it.
I assume she also wasn't into hiking.
She's going skydiving for her 33rd birthday, and I'm standing on land watching her do it because I'm not going up there with her.
Opposites attract was the first one that came to me. Oh yeah, in regards to like the zodiac, I don't know. For me, it falls a little bit more, and I also understand where this is gonna hit for you as well. For me, it skews a little bit closer to religion at times.
I knew you were gonna say
where
that.
It's from, which is why I'm a little bit less aggressive about it. I do think you are right at times in which it can be overly pursued, I think is the way that I would put it, and meaning that is not there can be made specifically by, like, I don't want to call them bad actors because that feels maybe a little bit too harsh, but by people who know that that is a vulnerable population at times. I do think that they can be taken advantage of, but as on the whole, it is something that I tend to try and respect more along the lines of religion. But that's not to say that I also don't understand fully why you feel the way that you feel about it, and I can understand that. But opposites attract was my biggest pop psychology one. I think you make a really, really great point about the legitimization of pop psychology by institutions in which we think are doing their research, when what actually probably happened was somebody who was just really, really good at selling it, and they decided to use it company wide. I mean, I didn't take this until college. I think you took it I didn't take this until grad school. I think you said you took it in high school, but like those career aptitude tests.
Yeah, I was supposed to be a plumber.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Those things that I know our parents definitely took. I didn't take them in high school, but I took them in grad school as kind of a way to look at these kinds of things and examine them and why they might not be useful. But maybe that's not one that's common anymore, but I don't know school system in America. That could still be something that it is, but if it is, then that's something else I'll throw into this category.
Yep.
Because you can't just put people into 10 different boxes for the way that life works.
Yeah, your MBTI is not ever going to be used as part of my assessment as a therapist, and I'll leave the second part out of it.
There you go. Yeah, I knew where you were going with that.
You know where I'm going with that.
I do indeed know where you were going with that. Yeah. I've seen that in workplaces. I've seen like company websites, normally like smaller companies, where like each employee will have their like MBTI like listed, where like this so and so is an INFJ, and they like X as like a way of like introducing the company, and I'm always just like, no thanks.
Hate it. I cringe at that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's fun. I'd be lying to you if I said it wasn't fun to do every now and then, but it's fun for me to do because I know how stupid it is.
Well, so I will say this though. In fairness to things like the Zodiac, the MBTI, Enneagrams, if they're taken with an informed approach, they can be useful because they do guide a level of self-reflection that you might not otherwise engage in if you weren't invested in it. So, like, I do think it's okay, like, I can't believe I'm about to say this, for, like, a Virgo to be reflective about their perfectionism. Like, there's, don't, okay, like, that there is some utility to that, because if you resonate with it, you can be mindful of how that affects the dynamics in your relationships. But if you take that verbatim and you say, well, because that fits, so does the rest of this, then you're missing the mark. Because a test like that's not gonna, I hate that I just said that, but it's, the Virgos know. Move on.
You know I'm a classic Libra.
And I'm aware that I'm a classic Aquarius by virtue of the fact that I hate the Zodiac. So let's keep moving.
I think this will probably end up being our last one, but I think it's a good one. I'm not going to ask the attachment question because then I think we're going to be here until 4 a.m. my time. So I'm going to ask this one, which is, can parasocial relationships ever result in healthy platonic romantic sexual relationships, or does the inherent power imbalance make that impossible?
Okay, first I'll define parasocial relationship very briefly for anybody who's watching this and doesn't know what that is. Parasocial relationships are essentially one-sided relationships where there is an unequal investment from one direction, and it often happens through virtual means. So an example of a parasocial relationship would be literally everybody who's watching this, your relationship to me is a parasocial relationship. You see me, you know what I sound like, you know what some of my values are, you can engage with me one-to-one in chat. I know very little about you, aside from what you disclose to me in chat. I know you as a username, and I know you as, like, through the context of what you've maybe shared in chat over the years that I've gotten to know you. So there is a inherent unbalancing there in terms of the investment of the relationship. Relationships to celebrities are another example of parasocial relationships. People think that they somehow have a relationship with a celebrity because they follow them on Twitter and can engage with them. These types of things. There's a weird membrane of social engagement that technology facilitates, and that creates these parasocial relationships. So this is a hard question to answer because in some ways, by definition, if you have a platonic, romantic, or sexual relationship, it's likely no longer parasocial. Now, if you are talking about, I'm going to have to use this as the example. There is, to some extent, a parasocial relationship. I'm going to use porn as an example of a parasocial relationship that people don't talk about very often, because that's a parasocial sexual relationship. If there's a particular porn star or porn stars that you find to be attractive, if there's a OnlyFans that you engage with and spend money on and have influence over because you make certain donations, if there's like these types of relationships, if there's a cam person that you watch that you donate to and invest in monetarily and can influence through those monetary donations, that can facilitate a sexual parasocial relationship, where essentially you have one person who is, we'll assume that masturbation's happening within that context. You have one person who is masturbating directly to that specific person, but the person on cam, perhaps if they're masturbating, isn't masturbating to you, they're masturbating to a wide general audience, right? So there's an unbalancing there. So if you start to talk about having kind of a one-to-one relationship where you're engaging via like DMs in a way where each person is consenting to that in a particular way, it starts to bleed out of parasocial and into either acquaintance or friendship or whatever it may be. So it gets really tricky. There is a power imbalance. Oftentimes people think that the people in position of power is the viewer, because they're the one that are spending money, you know, doing things to influence the streamer in certain ways, creating the question that the streamers are reacting to. But in reality, the person with power is the streamer, and streaming is probably the most common example that I can think of. But like again, it's unbalanced because they have power because they're less invested in the relationship with you as you are to them. So this is a really hard one for me to be able to answer in any kind of like concrete, fulfilling way, because you start to get into the specific nuances of the relationship itself, where, you know, if all of a sudden, if I go have a beer with a viewer, is that a parasocial relationship anymore? Perhaps not. Perhaps it is. It comes down to kind of the machinations of that and the level of investment and consent from each party on what it is. So a little bit of an all over the place answer, but it's a hard question to answer.
I feel like you answered the second part of that. I feel like the question was so much more surface level than that. Like, can a parasocial relationship ever turn into those things? Yeah, sure. Is it likely that they're going to turn into those things? I would say no. At least in regard to, say, streaming. The likelihood that you are going to become one of these things with the streamer that you love and watch is very slim.
Right.
And I think that's one of the problems that people run into, both on the viewer side and the streamer side, because this whole thing that we are currently engaging in right now is so brand new to the brain that we still don't really know how to fully conceptualize and process it. So that would be my answer to the question. I think you answered the question after that question, which is great. It's a good to go down that route. I'm also, I don't know, I'm really curious about the last part, because would you say there is an inherent power imbalance in a parasocial relationship?
Yes, I would.
Go into where that power imbalance happens.
I at any time can terminate a person's ability to interact with me. So no person, this relationship only happens insofar as I facilitate it. I at any point could stop streaming, shut down the Discord, and go off the grid. right? So could a person in chat, right? But this
Yeah.
entire relationship is founded upon my initiation of it. I don't exist because a viewer hits a go live button and I show up, right? Like I don't get engagement on Twitter unless I post a tweet. My Discord doesn't exist if I don't create it. So as like there's an inherent power imbalance in the sense that like I have created this space. And here's the thing is like when I say something like I'm going to give an example, and I hope this doesn't upset people to hear, but like when I say at the end of every stream, you matter, your experiences are valid, don't let anybody ever tell you otherwise. I'm saying that, and I genuinely mean that. People that are watching the stream will watch that and think that I'm speaking to them directly. And I kind of am, but I'm speaking to a community. I'm not just speaking to you. And where parasocial relationships can become problematic is when people think that the streamer or the celebrity is speaking really only to them, that they somehow are differentiated amongst the group in a way that like they have more of a relationship than just streamer viewer, even though the relationship is streamer viewer. So there is a power imbalance there. I think people sometimes think that if they donate a certain amount of money or if they send a certain amount of bits or whatever, that they are creating power, that perhaps they are reeling themselves into intimacy with that person. But I will tell you, and Jared knows this because he's actually one of my best friends, the chances that I would be friends with any single person in chat is incredibly low because I have a hard enough time maintaining my closest friendships at times that have already been established over many years. Like I'm slippery and I know that about myself. And so I am also a person that generally has to be initiated with rather than me doing the initiating. And so the chances that I would facilitate a relationship beyond streamer viewer with anybody in chat is incredibly low. And I know that, but viewers don't necessarily know that. I love when people, engage with me. I love that I get to know you guys. I love that you tell me the impact that this stream has on you. All of these things mean a lot to me. Don't get me wrong. I care about everybody who's watching this, but it's not, I don't have the relationship with anybody in chat other than Sean that I have with Jared. And that's just kind of a fact of the matter. And so when people start to believe that they're entitled to a relationship with a streamer or a public presence just because they have the ability to interact with them on social media, that's where we see real problems.
So I'm trying to, I hate the term devil's advocate. So I'm trying to flesh out this conversation just because I think it's an interesting one, and I think it's one that we have a lot in this space. Yep. And so I'm really, really fascinated by the idea of a power balance because, like you said, you are the one who goes live, you are the one who controls this space, all of that. And the viewer still has power in whether or not they decide to watch you. Yep. Whether or not they decide to engage into your chat, whether or not they decide to block you and make sure that your content doesn't show up on their page. Yep. So, like, I'm curious where you personally think the imbalance begins.
I think the imbalance begins anytime something happens outside of the defined terms of the relationship. So, for example, my general the general vibe of relationship in my stream is I stream, there's a community, you guys have the ability to interact with me while I'm streaming, and you also know that my DMs are generally open on Discord and that you can like tag me on stuff on Twitter, right? But if a person reaches out to me, now there are exceptions to this, okay? But in general, I'm going to speak in general here. if a person reaches out to me and starts to engage with me beyond that context, perhaps that person says like, hey, like I would, I really want to meet up, which people say they want to meet up and that's fine. But if I say, no, I'm good. And then a person says, but I've been watching you for years. I don't understand why you wouldn't want to see me for drinks because I'm in Vegas. Now that has pushed past the boundaries of what we have set up. And now that's an issue. But where the power imbalance, I think, in particular would come into play is if I came into your DMs and suggested that. Because I have influence over people, partly because of who I am and the credentials I have, but also because I am the streamer facilitating this space. I carry real power in the Discord. If I come in and I say, hey, knock it off, or if I start getting creepy and pushing people's boundaries, like, I'm in a position of power to be able to do that more than somebody else can do that with me. Certainly people could block me, of course, but that's in some ways, and this is to an extreme, but that's similar to saying like, well, if you're in an abusive relationship, you could just leave. It's not always that easy, right? Like, I am far more able to do problematic things to a viewer than I think a viewer is to me.
Okay, so then for you, the simple interaction of streamer to viewer, viewer to streamer is not an inherent imbalance of power. It has to occur once something changes within that
outside the bounds of that consensual relationship.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Because I think that's one of the reasons why I found the question so interesting. Because like, I don't necessarily think that I have any more power over a viewer simply watching me than they have over themselves on whether or not they want to watch me or engage with me. I think that is, at that point, a perfectly reasonable, balanced relationship. Still parasocial, but balanced. But then when other things start happening, that's when I think you get more into the conversation of imbalance.
I mean, I also think that imbalance is relative to the nature of whatever, like, the public figure is trying to accomplish. Like, I mean, if I use myself as an example, I know that I know this because people have told me. So I know there are people that have been profoundly impacted by this stream. Mm-hmm. Like, I know that there are people that, because of like what I've said or how I've interacted, it has made a difference in their life, sometimes to a profound way, right? Mm-hmm. Well, you and I both know, because we're therapists, that when you facilitate something like that, even not in the bounds of a professional relationship, there's power there.
Yeah.
Right? So if I'm at TwitchCon and you're a person who has been really strongly affected by how I have shown up on my stream, and you come up to me at TwitchCon and you ask for a hug, and I sexually harass you, you may experience that, or like that may be more okay or more scrambled because I've meant something to you. I have more of an ability to cause a problem for you or put you in an uncomfortable position because I'm leveraging what I've meant to you, which is different than what you've meant to me as a viewer. And that's not to diminish how much people mean to me as viewers, but I have a proportionately different impact on viewers than viewers have on me.
Interesting. I also think you particularly are in a different position than most just because of the type of stream that you run.
I agree.
And because of, the content that you put out. Whereas like for me, although I wonder if you could argue this. For me, I have a very strict boundary on what goes on in my stream. So you could say there is an inherent power imbalance there because I dictate clearly that certain things are not going to happen there. And if that doesn't match with the vibe I'm putting out, you're gone. But I don't run them in a health stream, which would be, I don't know. It's interesting there.
But even like take like your standard like, top 0.1% Call of Duty streamer or something, or like big gaming streamer. That still exists, because the thing is, like, from an evolutionary perspective, humans idealize other humans that get the support and push from other humans. Like, we perceive them as having something inherently more than we have because they've gathered social reinforcement. So if you're a big time streamer and you're in a position where you are interacting with viewers, it is way easier for you to violate boundaries of viewers than it is for them to violate yours, though they certainly can, because you have power in the idealization that folks have created around you. So people are more willing to let their boundaries down on people that they idealize than they are people that they do not idealize. So it makes it so that, like, and I'm sure that people can think of examples maybe that they've heard or that they've experienced themselves where people in these types of positions of power as public figures have been able to get away with a lot of shit because they have public clout and benefit of the doubt. I get the benefit of the doubt, and I could leverage that for evil if I wanted to. Lay folks or viewers don't get the benefit of the doubt in that way.
This still gets more fascinating to me because I think there's a difference between idealizing someone, say a streamer or a public figure, and simply just interacting with them.
See, I don't know that you could detach the two in a streaming context because people have choice. You're not going to watch people that you're just kind of meh about when there's another person that you are more invested in. So I think there, and
I will.
Yeah, I know.
But you know how I interact with
I do.
Twitch. I might be
much different than how I do it.
I might be out of the norm.
You know this. Sean knows this. Chat doesn't know this as intimately as you guys do. There is a lot of me that doesn't show up on stream.
Yeah.
Right? And so it is inherently people fill in certain gaps of that with idealization, because if you're watching me, it means that there's something you like about me as the streamer. And so you're more likely to plug holes with idealized traits than you are demonized traits, because if you fill the holes with demonized traits, then why are you watching that person or engaging with them in the first place? So because of that imbalance, I am the foundation of idealistic projection, as I think even a non-mental health streamer could be, and that gives me power. And I think that happens in any kind of parasocial relationship.
Just for curiosity's sake, then, because we do know this is a thing. If you were to take somebody who does, for instance, engage in something like hate watching, or you could maybe even go here with a troll, where does that, because that is also a parasocial, where does that lie as far as the power goes? Is that still on the side of the streamer, or is that on the side of the hate watcher / troll?
Well, I think then you're going to have to get into the relative identity of the streamer, because, right? Because, like, if I get hate rated, it doesn't have the same impact as if you get hate rated. Right? So people coming in and saying really stupid shit in my stream is something that I really don't know what a person could say in my chat that would be harmful to me. Like, I just don't. Right? There's not really an ability for anybody in chat to take power away from me. But there is a way for people to take power away from you. There is a way for people to take power away from an LGBTQIA+ streamer. Like, so now we're getting into relative identity when we're talking about it. Because, like, do you have power as a streamer? Yes. But if you get hate rated with a bunch of terrible content, you know that that's going to have a profound effect on you. So there is ways for people in viewership to take power. And I always have to acknowledge that when I talk about these things, like, I am impenetrable as it relates to things like that. But it's, you know, a troll has as much power. This is total white dude conceptualization of trolls. Okay, so I acknowledge that up front. But, like, a troll has as much power as energy I give it. So if I derail my stream to interact with I think of it as like a person who heckles a comedian. Like, that heckler has as much power as the comedian gives it. If the comedian responds to the heckler and gives that energy, they've breathed life and power into that. Whereas if the comedian snaps for security and has that person removed immediately, it's diminished that person's power. You've exerted your power as the comedian on stage to be able to remove that person. We have that as streamers in the form of banning, right? But if you get brigaded by a ton of people that it's impossible for your mods to keep up with, well, now that power imbalance has happened. Even if it's in a small moment, it's easier to flip that power imbalance on certain folks than it is on others. Because if I have to kill my stream because of, like, you know, when you and I talked about the charity tire game, if I have to kill my stream because we get nasty people coming in because I'm doing a charity for the Trevor Project, right? That does give that power. It shows those folks that they have the power to influence my stream by getting me to end it by being hateful, right? But also, I have to protect certain folks in my community, and certain streamers have to protect themselves because the streaming space is a microcosm of society at large in some ways. So, I mean, obviously this gets ridiculously complex, and yeah, I'm sure you and I could have a conversation about this for hours because of how complex this gets. But the reality is, this is not a naturally occurring relationship. A parasocial relationship is not something that we would think about in terms of like natural evolution. This isn't parasocial relationships didn't exist 500 years ago. There was just they couldn't inherently exist. You were only in relationship to people that were proximal to you. I mean, I suppose they could in the form of like idealizing a certain like tribal leader or something like that. But like, it's a different vibe than when you have technology assisted relationship that you can exert influence on directly but indirectly. And you can do it with like resources and stuff in the form of money and stuff like that. You know, like people start to think they're entitled based on allocating resources in a certain direction. And, you know, are you entitled to acknowledgement? I could argue yes, but like, are you entitled to be able to dictate the terms of my stream because you donate $2,000 to it? No, that's a choice that you've made.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from with it. I know I said that was gonna be a short question. It ended up not being it.
That's all right. It was a good one because I mean, relationship Q&A, parasocial relationships are inherently going to come up in this space, and I don't think they get talked about as often as they should.
I think they get talked about a lot, but only in a one-dimensional way. Because I don't think a lot of people know how to talk about them, or they just don't feel like going into the weeds like we just did. But I mean, the amount of times I see the word parasocial on Twitter every day is ridiculous. Following all the streamers that I follow, and there's a lot of different viewpoints, and so I don't know. This is a conversation we're going to be having for. I mean, I would imagine years. I personally don't see streaming going anywhere anytime soon.
No.
Unless something just ridiculous happens. So I think we're going to be talking about this for a while.
I do too. And I know, I mean, my hope would be that there's going to be some research that emerges in the next couple of years. It's been pretty slow going with getting parasocial.
I'm sure there's
research.
some going on.
Oh yeah,
right now
for sure.
That we don't know about, you know.
Yep.
But yeah, fascinating topic.
It is.
That's all I got for you today, or tonight, or whatever time it is where you are. I mean, obviously, like I was getting questions while we were doing this, and the page filled back up. So
guess we got to do part 3. Bummer.
Yep. Definitely got enough content.
Well, I will wrap up the VOD portion of this by saying to anybody who's watching this on YouTube, I really appreciate that you made it this far. I hope that our conversation and the answers to these questions have been meaningful to you in some way, that maybe you walk away from this feeling like you learned something. And I love doing these. I have to give credit where credit is due. Doing these was Jared's idea, so he gets all the credit for this. I'm really glad that we do it. I appreciate that you moderate this in the way that you do, and it makes it a lot easier for me to do this and to flow through it. And just on YouTube, if you've been watching this, I would love it if you left a comment, even if it's just to tell us what you thought of the episode. Are there things you liked? Are there things that you didn't like? Things that stood out to you? If you have a question that you want to ask, again, I encourage you to pop into the Discord. we will do another episode of this. We also are going to try at some point to do other topics, because parenting would be a really good one. It's one that I really want to talk about, maybe among some other things. So these are a lot of fun. We're trying to do them regularly. We're on a once a month cadence right now, which is pretty solid. And we've really enjoyed it. So I appreciate your engagement around it. Thank you for watching it. Make sure you like the stream. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel if you don't already. Catch us on Twitch at some time for the live stream. And we'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, it was fun. See ya relatively soon.